Hey everyone! So, if you didn't catch that in the very intro little blurb thing, I'm pregnant. It feels weird to make this video because it still doesn't feel really real, I guess. But I'm far enough along now that I feel comfortable sharing that with you guys. And also, there's a very high chance that there will be a couple more baby-related crafts in the near future, so now you guys know why that would be happening. For those of you who are curious, I am 15 weeks, which is a little over 3 months, so I'm into my second trimester. So for today's video, it will be the first of I don't know how many like baby-related crafts. I'm going to try my hand at making a baby quilt. I have done this once before, turned out alright. I made a little baby quilt for a friend like over 10 years ago, which is crazy to think that it's been that long. But that was my first quilt, and then 10 years later here I am making my own for my own little baby. God, that's still so weird to say. So I'm gonna walk you guys through how I did that. It's a very simple quilt, so you guys could possibly make them too. I feel like it's a very beginner quilt. But yeah, let's get started. Here are my fabrics. I wanted this quilt to feature creatures and plants from the swamp, since I currently live in New Orleans and this kid will be born in New Orleans, so I thought it would be cute to have a bunch of swampy things. There's gators, little peeking frog eyes, monstera leaves, some plants with bugs, you know, perfect for a baby quilt, and finally cranes, which I was informed after I finished the quilt that at first glance they kind of look like a bunch of sperm, so that's cool. Anyway, I'm gonna do a super simple design. Like I mentioned, this is the second quilt that I've ever made, and the first one that I did was like 10 years ago. So my plan is to do a quilt top of 8-inch squares, 4 squares by 5 squares, with the designs repeating about 4 times, with a bit of a border around them. For each of the fabrics for the quilt top, I cut 4 8.5 by 8.5 inch pieces. I'm going to be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I laid them all out in this pattern that I had come up with already. Here's the mock-up that I made. I wanted it to be kind of a random arrangement. I'm going to be working in rows, so it'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. I took one row and put 2 squares together, right sides touching. I pinned up the side and sewed it up. Then I lined up the next square, right sides touching, pinned and sewed it on, and so on and so forth until row 1 was all sewn together, leaving me with a strip of fabric like this. Then I ironed the seams, opening them up like so to help keep the bulkiness down. I repeated this process for all of the rows. With that done, I could start sewing the rows together. I placed the first row onto the second row, right sides touching of course, pinned along the bottom and sewed them up. I continued pinning and sewing the rest of the rows on. Then like before, I ironed the seams down. Ironing to sewing is like sanding to woodworking for me. I freaking hate it because it takes forever, but man, it really helps your project look really nice when it's done. It's one of those things where like I'm always tempted to skip, and sometimes I do skip, as you'll see later, but I really regret it when I do skip it. But anyway, here it is so far, ready for the border. I measured the width and the length of this piece. Really, I should already know the measurements because of how I had pre-measured everything before, and I know that I have a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but you never know, sometimes it can be a little off. And actually I was kind of surprised that I kind of got it spot on this time, which was kind of nice. But anyway, I'm going to cut strips of the border / backing fabric to size. So right now, my sewn squares are 32.5 by 40.5 inches. I wanted to do the side borders first, and I wanted them to be 2 inches, so these needed to be 2 1/4 inch by 40.5 inches long. Then along the top and the bottom, those strips would need to be 2 1/4 by 37 inches. So for me, this fabric pattern has a definite up and down, and I wanted it to match all the way around the blanket, but I'm also using it as a backing fabric for this quilt. I ran into a problem that was that I couldn't cut a 40.5 long strip in the direction that I needed because it would cut into what I needed for the backing. I didn't buy enough fabric to kind of account for this. So my super simple solution was to just break each side strip into 2 pieces, which I would then sew together, and then that would create a 40.5-inch strip. So that's what I did. But since this strip has a seam now, I decided to pin the sides on, lining the seam to one of the existing seams of the squares. I figured this would kind of help camouflage it once I start quilting all the layers together. And you can actually see here that I didn't cut the strip down to 40.5 inches just yet. I left it long because I wanted to make sure that once I aligned the seams that I would have enough fabric going both ways before I cut it to size. Anyway, I pinned the sides on and sewed them in place, and then I cut the extra fabric off. I ironed the seams, and then I pinned the top and the bottom strips and sewed them on. Then I ironed them, of course. And you can see this thing is coming together. I laid out my quilt batting, and then I laid my sewn quilt top over it. The batting I got is obviously way too big, so I pinned the quilt top onto it, making sure to smooth everything out, and then I cut the batting to size. Then I laid my backing fabric down, wrong side up, and then I laid my quilt top and batting over it, making sure to leave excess fabric around each side. This will later become the border. Like before, I smoothed everything out and pinned all 3 layers together. At this point, I switched to using safety pins instead of normal pins. I probably should have done this in the last step because I kept poking myself with the pins, but whatever. Better late than never. Once it was all smoothed out and pinned, it was time to quilt. I did end up putting a couple extra pins along where I was going to be sewing, just to make sure to keep the fabric in place. I switched out my presser foot to this other foot that has a little roller to help the fabric glide through. Was it necessary for me to switch them out? I don't know, but it felt right, so I did it. I guess ideally you'd have a walking foot for this, but I don't have one. I never really saw the need to get one because I don't quilt often, but I don't know. Maybe I'll get one now because this was actually kind of a fun project to do. Anyway, going into this, I had grand ideas of doing an intricate design with the stitch work. But when I finally got to this point, I chickened out and went with a simple stitch in the ditch. Basically, you just sew right into the seams, like right into that ditch. Easy and effective. I figured if I got the courage to do more, I could always go back and do that later. And now that the layers are all quilted together, it's time for the border. I cut the backing fabric on each side down to the same width. My ruler was the perfect size, so I just used that to help trim it up. I think it was about 1 1/4 inch wide. Then I folded the fabric down until it hit the quilt top edge and ironed that down. Then I folded it over once more over the quilt top fabric and ironed it again. This gives a really nice and clean edge, and you don't have to fuss with bias tape or anything like that. When you get to a corner, fold the fabric diagonally like so, lining it up with the edge of the quilt top, iron it down, then basically just continue what you were doing before. Fold the fabric down until it hits the edge of the quilt top, iron, fold it down again, and iron again. And then you'll have this nice, neat little corner like so. Anyway, I pinned all of the edges down. Like I mentioned earlier, I freaking hate ironing, and I was almost at the end of this project and I could see the finish line, and I ended up deciding to skip ironing the other 2 sides, and I just folded and pinned those edges down instead. Looking back, I wish I was just patient and ironed them too. I'm not sure if it's super noticeable, but I think the ironed edges look neater in the end. Anyway, now I sewed the edges down. I removed all of the safety pins, did one last ironing pass, and it was done. I am so happy with how this thing turned out. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, all of that good stuff. If you are interested in following me on any of my social media, the links to those will be down below. If you have any questions or suggestions for future videos, please leave a comment down below, and I'll see you next week. Thank you so much to my patrons for helping me produce this video. If you like my videos and have learned something from them, please consider supporting me on Patreon to help me continue to make them. It's totally optional, I'll still be making videos either way, it just helps me be able to put out better stuff. A link will be down below, or you can just click up here in the corner.